There's an ancient story of a fox who, driven by hunger, tried to reach some grapes hanging high on a vine. He leapt with all his strength to reach them, but was unable. And as he left defeated, he turned and remarked, "Those grapes aren't even ripe yet." If you've ever wondered about the origin of the phrase sour grapes, now you know. This story, it is said, originated from the mind of Aesop, a man who lived around 600 BC and who authored hundreds of fables that are now part of the fabric of our language and culture. In fact, their influence can be found in some pretty surprising places, not just as everyday idioms or cautionary tales for children, but arguably in the DNA of all modern storytelling. So come with me on a journey through time as we learn about some of the oldest stories in our civilization's memory. So the basic form of Aesop's fables is very simple. It's usually nothing more than a short scene involving one or more anthropomorphic animals. Some are so short, in fact, that they kind of test the boundaries of what we'd even call a story. Generally, their purpose is to impart a moral, sometimes paraphrased at the end. In the particular version I have here, The Fox and the Grapes ends by saying, "It's easy to scorn what you cannot get." Now, these fables have become so widespread and commonplace that they're essentially a moral encyclopedia, a repository for all of life's little lessons that's easily understandable and accessible even to young children. So a grasshopper sings and plays while an ant works hard at storing food. And when the winter comes, the hungry grasshopper begs for help, but the ant refuses, reminding him that he should have prepared. Or a crow sits in a tree with a piece of cheese in her mouth. A fox flatters her, praising her beauty and voice, and when the crow proudly opens her beak to sing, the cheese falls out and the fox snatches it. Beware flattery. Perhaps the most famous of Aesop's fables is The Boy Who Cried Wolf, whose moral is paraphrased here as, "You cannot believe a liar even when he tells the truth." So the fables moralize without preaching. They reveal basic truths by illustrating actions and their consequences. They're kind of like a kernel of storytelling, so understanding their form can actually be really instructive if you want to understand how stories fundamentally work. One interesting thing that's not really commonly known about Aesop's fables is that they're actually quite politically subversive. Many of them point out the hypocrisies of power and class structure. And that's because, according to many accounts of his life, Aesop was a slave, possibly from Africa. And this might explain why his fables include exotic animals like elephants, lions, and camels. The story goes that he was freed because of his genius as a fabulist, only then to be executed for exposing the greed and corruption of those in power. And in keeping with his style of storytelling, the city that executed him was punished by plague and pestilence. If you've ever wondered about the origin of the phrase, "the lion's share," you need look no further than Aesop, who recounts the fable of a lion who goes hunting with a fox, a jackal, and a wolf. When their prey is caught, the lion proclaims that the first quarter is mine because I am king, the second for my strength, the third for my courage, and as for the fourth, whoever touches it will feel my claws. Moral of the story, the strong take what they want and call it justice. So this one doesn't feel so much like a cautionary tale for children. It's much more like political satire. Now, another really interesting thing about these fables is that they have no primary written record, and it's unlikely that Aesop, if he existed, was even literate. They were passed down orally, and that means we have no way of definitively dating them, and therefore it's possible that these stories are much more ancient than we suppose. It might be the case that Aesop merely curated them, or that he formulated them in such a way that made them more memorable and culturally contagious. In some ways, they're the memes of the ancient world, and actually that is in keeping with the original meaning of the word coined by biologist Richard Dawkins in this book as a unit of culture that self-replicates like a gene. The moral of The Tortoise and the Hare, for example, is slow and steady wins the race, and that moral formulation is so useful that it's basically just become woven into the fabric of our culture. Kind of in the same way some of today's memes survive by means of being selected for their fitness in expressing just the right idea in a particular group chat. But of course, the fables were eventually committed to writing, and those written versions of the fables are what we're referring to today when we reference Aesop. Though even there, the story isn't so simple because the fables differ greatly based on the translation. The first collection of Aesop's fables to be written in verse, a literal version, was done by a Roman fabulist named Phaedrus in the 1st century AD, and the more poetic style gives the fables a sense of gravitas and often sharpens their political edge. So there's one fable called The Frogs Desiring a King. Basically, a bunch of frogs in a pond wish for a king, so they ask Jupiter for one. He throws a log into the pond, which freaks them out at first, but they get used to it, so they ask Jupiter for a stronger king, and he sends a stork, who then eats all the frogs. Moral of the story? Be happy with what you got. Now, think about how this fable might be interpreted by a first century Roman who is governed by an ineffectual senate controlled by a tyrannical emperor. Phaedrus writes his moral as, "You'd scorn the good king that you had, and therefore you shall bear the bad. Though slavery be no common curse, be still for fear of worse and worse." So maybe don't complain about the senate unless you want the emperor to be fully in charge. And Phaedrus could publish this subversive text without fear of persecution, given the pretext that the story is just a harmless little fable. So given how political these stories actually were, you might be wondering why today we think of them primarily as quaint children's stories. Well, for that we can fast forward to 17th century France, where you'll find the translations of Jean de La Fontaine, whose collection of fables became required reading in French schools. Ironically, the fables were seen by the bourgeois class as lessons in good behavior, and this connotation has kind of stuck with the fables ever since. Certainly the most extravagant showcase the fables ever received was The Labyrinth of Versailles, a hedge maze connecting 39 fountains, each depicting one of Aesop's fables. It was built by Louis XIV as an educational supplement for the young Dauphin. I think the concept was that the fables would help one to navigate the maze in much the same way their morals might help one to navigate life. Tragically, the labyrinth was removed in 1778 by Louis XVI, who might have benefited from some moral education of his own. And my favorite version of Aesop's Fables is actually a cartoon series which ran from 1921 to 1934. It was among the first cartoons ever screened in theaters. You'll probably recognize the rubber hose style of animation here that was the inspiration for Steamboat Willie, shown here under the full protection of copyright law. The cartoons told stories involving animals, and each episode ended with a paraphrased moral, but it was usually just nonsense, really more of a parody of the fable format itself. But actually that subversive intent is in keeping with the original spirit of the fables, which were always irreverent and satirical, and that spirit is consistent in cartoons throughout the 20th century. So it's just kind of funny to think that these ancient fables may have actually influenced 20th century animation so deeply. We kind of take for granted that cartoons are these short vignettes involving common animals, but without Aesop, it might never have been so. Another cartoon that comes to mind is the 1954 animated film Animal Farm, based on George Orwell's classic tale, which he himself often referred to as a modern fable. And that's because the story is distinctly allegorical. We're meant to know what each animal represents in the story, whether it's specific historical figures like Karl Marx or Joseph Stalin, or whether it's something more abstract like the working class. Obviously, the sheep in the story are gullible in much the same way the animals of Aesop's fables have characteristics that reflect their nature. So the lion is powerful, the fox is cunning, the wolf is greedy, and so on. And the events that unfold in Animal Farm also articulate a moral in much the same way Aesop does. Something like noble revolutions can become tyrannical, or maybe something more general like power corrupts. By the way, while I was researching this video, I discovered that a new Animal Farm was produced in 2025, directed by Andy Serkis, and starring some big names like Seth Rogen, Woody Harrelson, and Glenn Close. So again, it'll be interesting to see how that fable will have been updated to reformulate its moral. And that kind of brings me to what I believe makes Aesop's Fables so fascinating. They really show you that the core of good storytelling is its moral formula, almost like an equation or a logical proof. So a shepherd boy repeatedly tricks the villagers by shouting wolf when there's no wolf. Then a real wolf appears. However, no one believes him. Therefore, his flock is lost. There's no style in the writing of that story. There's no dramatic flair, characterization, or lyricism. And yet, in just 29 words, it does tell a meaningful story. Sure, you could embellish it with more detail, but it's not strictly necessary because the essential formula is cogent. I actually think a lot of the empty writing we see in movies and TV shows today is ultimately because The writers have failed to recognize that the fable is the essential form of storytelling. It's the DNA of good writing. In fact, I've always thought a good litmus test for whether a story is well written or not is whether you can paraphrase the moral of the story in a succinct way. Original Star Wars trilogy, hope can redeem what power and fear cannot. Sequel trilogy, I don't know. You need to learn your true identity because somehow evil returns, but then love conquers all, and you need to accept the call of destiny. I don't know. Aesop's spinning in his grave here. At the end of the day, there's just no point in writing a story that doesn't communicate some kind of moral. And tracing the history of this particular set of fables reveals that storytelling is really just the mechanism by which groups of people make sense of the moral values of their own time. If you've never actually sat down and read them, I highly recommend doing so because it's a good way to stay in touch with some of our civilization's most enduring moral insights. I've made an entire video about the moral of the Lord of the Rings movies that you might find interesting if you liked this video. And get subscribed because I'll probably do many more similar videos. So thank you for watching. Check out my Patreon if you'd like to support this channel, and I'll see you on the next one.